Welcome back to Simply About Earth, where we tell the stories that shaped our world, one ember at a time. Before we begin tonight's journey into the flames that consumed medieval London, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Maybe you're curled up in a cozy apartment, safe from the elements, or perhaps you're listening from somewhere far from the ancient streets we'll walk together tonight. We love knowing where our community gathers to explore these forgotten chapters of human history. Time your lights, settle into that familiar space where history meets dreams, because tonight we're traveling back to September 1666, to a city of timber and thatch, of narrow alleys and wooden bridges, where one small spark would grow into an inferno that changed London forever. This is the story of 4 days that consumed a medieval city, and from its ashes birthed the London we know today. So breathe deep, let the modern world fade away, and step with us into the smoky dawn of September 2nd, 1666. The year is 1666, and London sleeps uneasily in the grip of late summer heat. The Thames flows dark and sluggish past the city's ancient walls, carrying the scents of tar and timber, fish and refuse, all the perfumes of a medieval port city, where 300,000 souls crowd together in a labyrinth of wooden houses that lean against each other like old friends sharing secrets. But tonight there are no secrets that fire cannot tell. Picture this London, this city that exists on the very edge of the modern world, still medieval in its bones but beginning to dream of empire. The streets are nothing like the broad avenues we know today. They wind and twist like rivers through the ancient landscape, following paths that were old when the Romans walked them, shaped by centuries of organic growth rather than any grand design. Pudding Lane, where our story begins, is barely wide enough for a cart to pass. The houses lean inward at their upper stories, creating tunnels of shadow where neighbours can reach across the narrow gap to shake hands from their bedroom windows. These overhanging upper floors, they're called jetties, and they're a mark of prosperity in medieval London. The more your upper story projects over the street below, the more space you have, and the more important you appear to your neighbours. But on this fateful night in early September, those overhanging stories will become highways for flame. Thomas Farriner's bakery sits at the heart of this wooden world, a 3-story building of oak and elm, its ground floor dominated by the great ovens that have fed the neighbourhood for years. Farriner is the king's baker, a man of some standing in his community, responsible for providing the daily bread that sustains thousands of London's citizens. His bakery operates on royal licence, which means he's one of the few bakers in London authorised to bake throughout the night, ensuring fresh bread for the morning markets. The building itself tells the story of medieval London's growth. Originally a single-storey shop built in the late 1500s, it has grown organically over the decades. A second story added when Farriner's business prospered, a third floor when his family expanded, rooms and extensions added whenever need and opportunity coincided. Like most of London, it's a building that has evolved rather than been planned, a wooden organism that has adapted to the changing needs of its inhabitants. The timbers that frame the building, these massive oak beams that form its skeleton, they're old-growth English oak, cut from forests that were ancient when they fell, oak that was seasoned for years before it was ever shaped into beams, oak that should last for centuries if properly maintained. But this summer, this terrible summer of 1666, has been different from any in living memory. The drought began in March, when the spring rains that usually soak the English countryside simply failed to come. Week after week passed without significant rainfall, and as spring turned to summer, the drought deepened. The Thames dropped to levels not seen in decades. Wells dried up across the countryside, and in London the wooden bones of every building began to desiccate under the relentless sun. By August the situation had become desperate. The normally green English countryside turned brown and brittle, harvests failed across the kingdom, and in London the timber frames of buildings that had stood for centuries began to crack and split in the heat. The constant moisture that usually kept English wood flexible and strong simply disappeared, leaving behind buildings that had become little more than elaborate kindling. But still life in London continued much as it always had. Markets opened each morning, merchants hawked their wares in the ancient streets, housewives haggled over prices while children played in the shadows of overhanging houses. The city's rhythm, established over centuries, proved remarkably resistant to the subtle changes that drought was working in its very foundations. Thomas Fariner went about his daily routine on September 1st, much as he had for years, mixing dough in the pre-dawn darkness, feeding his great ovens with seasoned wood and coal, baking the hundreds of loaves that would feed his corner of London. His apprentices, young men learning the ancient craft of bread-making, worked beside him through the night, their faces lit by the orange glow of oven fires that had burned in this same spot for decades. The ovens themselves are marvels of medieval engineering, great chambers of brick and stone designed to hold heat for hours after the fires are banked. During the day, they bake bread at temperatures that would be impossible to achieve with ordinary hearth fires. At night, when the baking is done, the residual heat warms the entire building, a practical system that provides both livelihood and comfort to the Fariner family. But tonight something is different. Perhaps it's the extreme dryness of the air, perhaps a coal shifted in ways it never had before, perhaps the wooden supports around the ovens, dried by months of unprecedented heat, finally reached some critical point of desiccation. Whatever the exact cause, and historians still debate the precise mechanism, sometime in the early hours of September 2nd, the carefully banked fires in Fariner's ovens find their way into the wooden structure of the building itself. It begins so quietly, so subtly, that Thomas Fariner sleeps through the first hour of his own catastrophe. A coal glows too close to a beam, a draught carries heat into a space where it's never been before, a piece of kindling, stored too near the ovens, reaches the temperature where wood begins its transformation from solid matter to flame and gas. The chemistry of combustion is simple and terrible. When wood is heated beyond a certain point, around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, it begins to decompose, releasing flammable gases that can ignite with just a spark. In normal circumstances, this happens slowly, safely, under controlled conditions. But when wood has been dried to the consistency of tinder by months of drought, when the very air is empty of the moisture that usually provides some protection against rapid combustion, then the process can accelerate beyond anyone's ability to control it. By 1 o'clock in the morning, these invisible gases are beginning to accumulate in the space beneath Fariner's bakery. By 2 o'clock, they've reached concentrations that make the air itself explosive, and sometime around 2:30, a spark finds them. The explosion, for that's what it is, though witnesses will later describe it as a sudden rush of flame, blows out the ground floor windows of the bakery and sends fingers of fire racing up through the building's wooden frame. The sound, a deep whoosh followed by the crack of splintering timber, wakes Thomas Fariner from the deepest sleep he's ever known. But waking to find your home on fire, waking to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of flames below your feet, this is every medieval homeowner's nightmare. Fire, in a world built almost entirely of wood, is not just a threat to property, it's a threat to life itself, spreading so quickly through dry timber that escape becomes a matter of seconds rather than minutes. Fariner's first instinct is for his family, his wife sleeping beside him, his daughter in the next room, his apprentices in the garret above. The stairs, those wooden stairs that connect the floors of his home, are already beginning to smoke as flames reach up from below like grasping fingers. In minutes, perhaps less, they will be impassable. But Fariner is a man who has lived his entire life around fire, who understands its moods and capabilities better than most. He knows that once flame takes hold in a wooden building, there is no fighting it, only flight. He wakes his family with shouts and pushes them toward the one escape route that might still be open, the upstairs window that leads onto the steep pitch of the bakery's roof. Imagine, if you can, climbing out of a second-story window onto a roof that slopes at a dangerous angle, in the middle of the night, while below your feet the building burns with increasing intensity. The tiles are still cool under their feet, but they can feel the heat beginning to rise through the roof timbers. They have minutes, perhaps less, before the entire structure becomes a torch that will be visible for miles. From the bakery roof, the Fariner family can see across the narrow gap to their neighbour's house. It's a jump that would be challenging in daylight, terrifying in darkness, but with flames licking at the roof behind them, it becomes their only chance for survival. One by one, Thomas first, then his wife, then their daughter, they leap across the void and land on the neighbouring roof with impacts that send tiles sliding into the street below. Behind them, their home, their livelihood, their accumulation of a lifetime's work. disappears into a column of orange light that seems to reach toward the stars themselves. But they are alive, and in the narrow world of medieval London, where fire can turn a family into refugees in a matter of minutes, survival is often the only victory possible. But even as the Fariner family catches their breath on their neighbour's roof, even as they watch a lifetime's work disappear into flame and smoke, the real tragedy is just beginning. Because in a city built almost entirely of wood, where houses press against each other like books on a shelf, fire is never content to consume just one building. The flames from Fariner's bakery reach across the narrow gap of Pudding Lane like fingers searching for something to grasp. They find the Star Inn, that ancient tavern where travellers have sought food and lodging for generations. The inn's timber frame, seasoned by decades of English weather, but now dry as kindling after months of drought, receives the fire like an old friend. The Star Inn has stood on this spot for nearly a century, a 3-story building of oak and elm, its ground floor dominated by the great common room where merchants and craftsmen gather each evening to drink ale and share the news of the day. Like most London taverns, it's built around a central courtyard where horses are stabled and goods are stored, a design that in normal times provides security and convenience. But tonight that courtyard becomes a chimney, drawing flames upward and outward with terrifying efficiency. The hay stored for the horses, the wooden barrels of ale and wine, the very timbers that frame the building, all of it becomes fuel for a fire that grows stronger with each new thing it devours. The inn's residents, merchants and travellers who chose this establishment for its reputation and comfort, wake to find themselves trapped in a burning building with only minutes to escape. Some flee through windows, others rush down stairs that are already beginning to smoke and char. But all of them, guests and staff alike, become refugees in the space of a single night, carrying nothing but the clothes they wore to bed. And still the fire spreads, still it reaches across the narrow streets of medieval London like some vast living thing searching for nourishment, from the Star Inn to the next building, and then the next, each structure feeding the flames until they grow strong enough to leap even wider gaps, to reach even farther into the heart of the ancient city. By dawn on September 2nd, what began as one baker's personal tragedy has become a neighbourhood crisis. 6 buildings consumed, entire families made homeless, and still the fire shows no signs of slowing. The orange glow that began as a flicker in Thomas Fariner's ovens now lights the London sky like some terrible sunrise, visible from the Tower of London, from London Bridge, from across the Thames where people stand on the South Bank and point in wonder and horror at the spectacle unfolding on the North Shore. The morning air, usually cool and moist from the Thames, carries the acrid scent of burning wood and thatch across the entire city. Ash begins to fall like grey snow in neighbourhoods miles from the fire, and those who have lived in London long enough to remember previous fires begin to feel the first stirrings of real fear. Because this fire is different. It burns with an intensity that veterans of previous London blazes have never seen, consuming buildings so completely that within hours, only foundations remain. The heat rising from the flames creates its own wind patterns, drafts that pull fresh air into the fire's heart and send sparks spinning high into the morning sky. Samuel Pepys, the diarist whose careful observations will preserve this tragedy for future generations, wakes this Sunday morning to reports of a significant fire somewhere in the distance. But London is a city where fires happen regularly, house fires, shop fires, the occasional conflagration that consumes a few buildings before being brought under control. From his window, Pepys can see smoke in the distance, but nothing that seems to require immediate concern. How wrong he is, and how quickly he will learn the extent of his error. Because by the time church bells across London ring for morning service, the fire has made a discovery that will transform it from a local disaster into a citywide catastrophe. It has found Fish Street Hill, that narrow, winding thoroughfare that connects Pudding Lane to London Bridge, lined with shops and houses and taverns, all built of the same drought-dried timber that has fed the flames so generously through the night. Fish Street Hill, in the geography of medieval London, is more than just another street. It's a major artery connecting the bridge to the heart of the old city, a commercial thoroughfare where merchants sell fish brought up from the Thames, where travellers heading north pause for food and drink, where the narrow medieval world opens briefly into something approaching a proper roadway. But this morning, this fateful Sunday morning, Fish Street Hill becomes something else entirely. It becomes a chimney, a perfect funnel that draws the fire upward from Pudding Lane toward London Bridge, with terrifying speed and efficiency. The houses that line Fish Street Hill are typical of medieval London's commercial districts. 3- and 4-story buildings with shops on the ground floor and living quarters above. Their upper stories overhang the street, creating a tunnel effect that on normal days provides shade and protection from the weather. But with fire racing up the hill from below, those overhanging stories become a roof over the flames, concentrating the heat and creating updrafts that fan the fire to even greater intensity. The merchants who live and work on Fish Street Hill, fishmongers and bakers, tavern keepers and craftsmen, wake to find their street transformed into a corridor of flame. The fire doesn't creep up the hill. It races, consuming building after building with such speed that escape becomes a matter of pure chance. Some families flee through back doors and narrow alleys, others find themselves trapped as flames block their only exit routes. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the fire's advance up Fish Street Hill is its sound, the deep roar of flames consuming vast quantities of wood and thatch, punctuated by the crack and crash of falling timbers and the periodic boom of exploding shops as the heat reaches stored goods that burn with particular intensity. By mid-morning, the fire has reached the top of Fish Street Hill and stands poised to make its next conquest, London Bridge itself. That ancient crossing, that medieval city built on stone arches above the Thames, that lifeline connecting London to the world beyond. London Bridge in 1666 is not the simple span of stone and steel that modern minds might imagine. It's a city unto itself, a narrow street suspended above the Thames, lined with houses and shops that rise 4 and 5 stories above the dark water. For nearly 500 years, London Bridge has been more than just a crossing. It's been a neighbourhood, a marketplace, a community where families have lived and worked for generations. The houses on London Bridge are marvels of medieval engineering, multi-story buildings constructed on a foundation just 20 feet wide, cantilevered over the Thames in defiance of gravity and common sense. They lean inward toward each other, creating a covered street that provides shelter from the weather while allowing just enough space for carts and pedestrians to pass. But like everything else in London, like every other structure in this medieval city, London Bridge is built almost entirely of wood. The stone arches that support it are ancient and strong, but the buildings that line it are timber frame structures that have been baking in the summer heat for months. Their wooden bones dried to the consistency of tinder. The fire reaches London Bridge shortly before noon on Sunday, pouring across from Fish Street Hill like a river of flame. The first building to catch, a bakery at the north end of the bridge, becomes a torch that can be seen from miles away, its flames reflecting off the dark surface of the Thames like some hellish beacon. For a moment, just a moment, it seems possible that the Thames itself might stop the fire's advance. Water, after all, has always been fire's great enemy, and the river flows broad and deep beneath the bridge, offering the promise of safety to anyone brave enough to launch a boat into the dark current. But London Bridge is more than a bridge. It's a tunnel of wood and thatch suspended above the water, and once fire enters that tunnel, it spreads with a speed that defies belief. Building after building catches flame, house after house disappears into the growing inferno, until the entire north end of London Bridge becomes a wall of fire stretching across the Thames. The residents of the bridge, families who have lived above the dark water for generations, flee in whatever ways they can. Some escape across rooftops to the south bank, others climb down to the water level and launch boats into the Thames, but many find themselves trapped as flames block escape routes that seemed safe just minutes before. The heat rising from the burning bridge, concentrated by the narrow space between the buildings, becomes so intense that it creates its own weather patterns. Updrafts spiral flames hundreds of feet into the air, downdrafts pull fresh oxygen into the fire's heart, and the wind generated by the burning itself begins to spread sparks across the Thames to the south bank, where new fires begin to bloom like deadly flowers in the wooden buildings of Southwark. But even as London Bridge burns, even as one of medieval London's most important landmarks disappears into flame and smoke, the true scope of the disaster is only beginning to become apparent. because the fire that began in Thomas Farriner's bakery has discovered something that will transform it from an urban fire into a force of nature. It has learned to create its own wind. The heat rising from hundreds of burning buildings, the massive columns of superheated air that spiral up from the flames like invisible tornadoes, these create pressure differentials that generate winds of their own, winds that blow sparks across streets that might otherwise have served as fire breaks, winds that fan existing flames to even greater intensity, winds that turn every ember into a potential seed of destruction. By Sunday afternoon, the fire has grown so large that it begins to change the weather over London itself. The massive updrafts create clouds, dark columns of smoke and ash that rise thousands of feet into the sky, and then spread outward like an umbrella over the entire city. The sun, visible just hours before, disappears behind a pall of smoke so thick that day becomes like twilight. Samuel Pepys, drawn by curiosity and growing alarm, finally makes his way toward the fire to see for himself what manner of blaze could produce such extraordinary effects. What he finds, what he records in his careful diary, is a sight that will haunt him for the rest of his life. "I saw a most horrid, malicious, bloody flame," he writes, struggling to find words adequate to describe the impossible sight before him. The fire has grown beyond anything in human experience, beyond anything that seems possible in a world where fires are usually small, local affairs that can be fought with buckets and determination. Buildings don't just burn, they seem to simply vanish, consumed so completely that within minutes only foundations remain. The heat is so intense that iron melts and runs like water, that stone splits and crumbles, that the very air seems to catch fire, creating whirlwinds of flame that dance through the streets like demons celebrating some infernal festival. But perhaps most terrifying of all, most beyond the comprehension of anyone who has never witnessed such a conflagration, is the speed of it all. Medieval fires usually burn slowly, creeping from house to house over the course of hours or days, giving residents time to flee and firefighters time to create fire breaks. But this fire, this monster born of drought and wind and the peculiar geography of medieval London, this fire moves like a living thing, consuming entire neighborhoods in the time it might normally take to burn a single building. Everywhere there are people, thousands upon thousands of Londoners fleeing their homes with whatever they can carry, carts pile high with furniture and clothing, families clutching children and whatever possessions they can save, merchants trying desperately to relocate their stock while around them, their neighbors' livelihoods disappear into columns of orange light. The narrow streets of medieval London, designed for foot traffic and occasional carts, become death traps when thousands of people try to flee at once. Cheapside, that great commercial thoroughfare that runs east to west through the heart of the city, becomes a river of refugees flowing away from the flames, carrying bundles and boxes, driving livestock, pulling handcarts loaded with the accumulated possessions of lifetimes. But the fire moves faster than the refugees, much faster. Streets that seemed safe when families began their evacuation are already burning by the time the slowest evacuees reach them. Entire neighborhoods disappear behind walls of flame, while their former residents are still struggling to escape with their belongings. The psychological impact, the sheer impossibility of what's happening, proves almost as devastating as the physical destruction. Londoners have lived with fire as a constant threat for centuries, but they've always believed it could be fought, contained, eventually controlled. The sight of flames that consume entire city blocks in minutes, that create their own weather, that seem to move with purpose and intelligence, this challenges everything they thought they knew about the nature of disaster. Some refugees head north toward the fields beyond the city walls where they hope to find safety in open ground. Others try to cross the Thames, though the southern bank is already beginning to show its own scattered fires, where sparks have carried across the water. Still others simply wander in circles, stunned by the speed of their transformation from comfortable citizens to homeless refugees. The roads leading out of London become clogged with desperate humanity, streams of evacuees carrying everything they can save from homes that no longer exist. Moorfields, that great open space north of the city walls, becomes a vast refugee camp where thousands of Londoners huddle around small fires, sleeping rough under the open sky, while behind them their city burns. And through it all, through the growing chaos and desperation, the fire continues its relentless advance. By Sunday evening, What began as a single bakery fire has consumed hundreds of buildings, dozens of neighborhoods, vast swaths of the city that took centuries to build. But this is still only the beginning, because the fire has learned something new during its first day of freedom. It has learned that it can jump rivers. The Thames, that great barrier that should have stopped its southward advance, has become just another obstacle to overcome. Sparks carried by the wind have already started fires in Southwark, and now the blaze burns on both sides of London's ancient lifeline. The night of September 2nd into September 3rd becomes something beyond the normal human experience of catastrophe. A landscape of orange light and billowing smoke, where the familiar shape of London disappears behind walls of flame that seem to reach toward the stars themselves. The wind, that terrible easterly wind that has fed the fire all day, continues its deadly work through the darkness, carrying sparks across the city like seeds of destruction. I hope you're staying with us on this journey into one of history's great urban disasters. If you're finding this deep exploration meaningful, if these forgotten human stories are touching something in you, please take a moment to like this video. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, one carefully researched chapter at a time. By dawn on Monday, September 3rd, the fire has accomplished something that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. It has spread far beyond its humble origins in Pudding Lane, far beyond the neighbourhood where it began, far beyond anything that anyone in 1666 believed possible for an urban fire. Gracechurch Street, that major thoroughfare that runs north from London Bridge toward the heart of the ancient city, has become a corridor of flame stretching as far as the eye can see. The medieval houses that line both sides of the street, houses where merchants and craftsmen have lived and worked for generations, have disappeared so completely that it becomes difficult to remember exactly where they once stood. The fire's appetite seems to grow with what it devours, each building feeding the flames until they burn hot enough to reach farther, consume faster, spread to structures that might have seemed safe just hours before. The heat rising from the burning city creates updrafts so powerful that they lift burning debris hundreds of feet into the air, and when that debris falls, it plants new fires wherever it lands. But perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction is the growing realization that London's medieval systems for fighting fire are completely inadequate against such a conflagration. The leather buckets, the human chains passing water from the Thames, the fire hooks designed to pull down buildings to create fire breaks, all of these traditional methods prove useless against flames that consume entire city blocks faster than firefighters can even reach them. The fire engines of 1666, such as they are, consist of little more than large syringes on wheels, hand-pumped contraptions that can barely wet down a single burning building, much less stop a wall of flame that stretches across multiple neighborhoods. Against a fire that has grown to create its own weather, that generates winds powerful enough to spread burning debris for miles, these medieval firefighting tools are as useless as trying to empty the Thames with a teacup. More tragic still, the attempts to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings ahead of the flames require tools and expertise that London simply doesn't possess. The hooks and ropes needed to pull down houses quickly, the trained crews who know how to create effective gaps, the leadership necessary to coordinate such efforts across a burning city. None of it exists in sufficient quantity to match the scale of the disaster. Instead, there are only scattered, desperate attempts by individual neighborhoods to save themselves, bucket brigades that are overwhelmed within minutes by flames they cannot even approach, families trying to soak their thatch roofs with precious water while around them, their neighbors' houses disappear into towers of fire. And through it all, through the growing desperation and the mounting evidence that traditional methods will not work, the authorities remain strangely paralyzed. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, makes his way to the fire zone on Monday morning to assess the situation personally. What he sees, what any reasonable person would see, is a disaster beyond anything in English experience, a conflagration that threatens to consume the entire ancient city. But somehow he cannot bring himself to acknowledge the true scope of what's happening. Perhaps it's the sheer impossibility of it all, the way the fire violates everything he thought he knew about how disasters behave. Perhaps it's the psychological difficulty of accepting that centuries of accumulated civilization can disappear in a matter of days. Or perhaps it's simply the very human tendency to minimize threats that exceed our ability to comprehend them. Whatever the reason, Sir Thomas Bloodworth looks out over a fire that has already consumed a quarter of London and declares that it's nothing more than a woman might put out by urinating on it. The comment, recorded by multiple witnesses, will haunt his reputation for centuries, but in the moment, it reveals something profound about the human capacity for denial when confronted with catastrophe beyond imagination. By Monday afternoon, the fire has accomplished something that should have been impossible. It has reached Cornhill, one of the highest points in the old city, crowned by the Royal Exchange where merchants from across Europe gather to trade in wool and spices, silk and precious metals. The Exchange, that symbol of London's growing wealth and international importance, becomes a torch visible from miles away as its roof timbers catch fire and send columns of flame hundreds of feet into the smoky sky. The Royal Exchange, built just a century earlier as a monument to London's commercial ambitions, represents everything the city hopes to become. Its classical architecture, its spacious galleries where merchants conduct business in comfort and style, its very existence as a purpose-built centre of international trade. All of this marks London's transition from a medieval port to a modern centre of commerce. But today, all of that ambition and achievement disappears into flame and smoke. The Exchange burns with particular intensity, its seasoned oak timbers and fine furnishings feeding a fire that can be seen from across the Thames, from the hills north of London, from every corner of the ancient city. The destruction of such a prominent landmark, such a symbol of London's hopes for the future, sends a message that reverberates far beyond the fire zone itself. If the Royal Exchange can burn, if even the most modern and substantial buildings in London can disappear in a matter of hours, then nothing is safe, nothing is permanent, nothing can be trusted to survive the appetite of flames that seem to grow stronger with each new thing they devour. From Cornhill, the fire spreads in all directions like spilled oil. It flows downhill toward Cheapside, that great commercial thoroughfare where London's most prosperous merchants have their shops and warehouses. It climbs toward the Guildhall, that ancient seat of London's government where the city's mayors and aldermen have governed for centuries. And most ominously, it begins its advance toward the west, where the greatest prize of all awaits the flames. St. Paul's Cathedral, that great medieval church that has dominated London's skyline for 600 years, stands directly in the fire's path, built of stone, roofed with lead, supported by massive oak timbers that were already ancient when they were cut. St. Paul's seems like it should be able to withstand what mere houses and shops cannot. Surely the cathedral will stand against the flames. Surely stone and lead and iron will prove stronger than fire. But as Monday evening approaches, as the fire continues its relentless advance toward the heart of medieval London, it becomes clear that this is no ordinary blaze. This is something that has transcended the normal rules of combustion, something that has learned to use the very structure of the city against itself, turning London's narrow streets into chimneys and its overhanging houses into fuel for its own expansion. The heat radiating from the fire zone has become so intense that it can be felt from blocks away, through stone walls, across open squares, even from boats on the Thames. The air itself seems to shimmer with thermal energy, and witnesses report that the very ground grows warm beneath their feet as the fire's influence spreads through the underground passages and cellars that honeycomb medieval London. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the sound, the deep, continuous roar of flames consuming vast quantities of timber and thatch, punctuated by the crash of falling buildings and the periodic explosions that shake the ground when the fire reaches stores of gunpowder or other combustible goods. It's a sound unlike anything in normal human experience, the voice of destruction itself, audible for miles and growing louder with each passing hour. As night falls on Monday, as September 3rd gives way to what will become the fire's most devastating day, London has already been transformed beyond recognition. Entire neighbourhoods have simply vanished. Streets that bustled with life just 2 days earlier now exist only in memory and ash. The medieval pattern of the city, those narrow alleys and overhanging houses that represented centuries of organic growth, is being erased as if it had never existed at all. But still the fire is not satisfied. Still it reaches outward and upward, consuming everything combustible in its path, and creating the conditions for its own continued expansion. The worst, the absolute worst, is yet to come. Monday night into Tuesday, September 3rd into September 4th, and the fire achieves a kind of terrible perfection. It has grown so large, spread so far, consumed so much, that it begins to create weather patterns all its own. The heat rising from hundreds of burning buildings generates winds that spiral upward like invisible tornadoes, creates downdrafts that pull fresh oxygen into the fire's heart, sends superheated air racing through the city's streets at speeds that fan existing flames to even greater intensity. The fire has become a storm, a weather system made of flame and smoke that dominates the landscape for miles around, from the countryside north of London, from the hills of Surrey to the south, from anywhere within 20 miles of the burning city. The glow on the horizon is visible through the night, painting the clouds orange and red like some apocalyptic sunset that refuses to end. But it's Tuesday morning, September 4th, that brings the fire's most symbolic victory. After 2.5 days of relentless advance, after consuming hundreds of buildings and displacing hundreds of thousands of people, the flames finally reach their greatest prize. St. Paul's Cathedral, that magnificent monument to medieval faith and craftsmanship, stands directly in the path of the advancing inferno. St. Paul's Cathedral in 1666 is not the Baroque masterpiece we know today, not Christopher Wren's vision of classical domes and perfect proportions. This is the old St. Paul's, the Gothic cathedral, that has stood at the heart of London for 6 centuries, its massive stone walls and soaring spire, a testament to the faith and skill of medieval builders. The cathedral is vast, longer than 3 football fields, its central spire reaching higher into the London sky than any other structure for miles around. Built of limestone quarried from the countryside around London, roofed with sheets of lead that weigh hundreds of tons, supported by oak timbers that were already giants when they fell in forests that are now just memory, St. Paul's seems like it should be able to withstand anything that mere fire can bring against it. The builders of the cathedral, those medieval masters who designed and constructed this monument to eternity, understood fire as a constant threat. They built in stone rather than timber, used lead instead of thatch, created a structure that should be able to survive any disaster that London might face. For 600 years, their confidence seemed justified. Through wars and plagues, political upheavals and social transformations, St. Paul's has stood unchanged, a fixed point in a world of constant flux. But the fire that approaches St. Paul's on Tuesday morning is unlike anything the cathedral's builders could have imagined. This is not the small, controllable fires they knew, not the hearth blazes and candle flames that were the most serious threats of their experience. This is a conflagration that has learned to use an entire city as fuel, that generates heat, intense enough to melt iron and split stone, that creates its own wind patterns and weather systems. The first assault comes not from flames licking at the cathedral's walls, but from the heat itself. As the fire surrounds St. Paul's, as burning buildings press close to the cathedral on all sides, the temperature around the great church begins to rise to levels that exceed anything in the builder's experience. The lead roof, those massive sheets of metal that have protected the interior for centuries, begins to soften under the intense heat. Lead melts at just over 600 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that seems almost cool compared to the inferno that now surrounds St. Paul's. But as the fire presses closer, as the heat becomes more intense, the cathedral's roof begins its transformation from solid metal to flowing liquid. At first, just small streams of molten lead trickle down the stone walls, but as the temperature continues to rise, those trickles become rivers of silver-bright metal that pool in the cathedral's courtyards and run through the surrounding streets like streams of liquid moonlight. The sight of St. Paul's weeping lead, of this ancient monument literally melting under the assault of heat and flame, strikes witnesses as both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because molten lead has its own luminous appeal, terrible because it represents the destruction of something that was built to last forever. But worse, much worse, is yet to come, because beneath that lead roof lie the cathedral's roof timbers, massive oak beams that have supported the cathedral's soaring stone vaults for centuries. These timbers, some of them 3 feet thick and 60 feet long, are the hidden skeleton that makes St. Paul's architectural ambitions possible, and they have been drying in the unprecedented heat of summer 1666 until they've become little more than enormous pieces of kindling. When the molten lead finally burns through, when the protective metal roof disappears entirely, and leaves the timber frame exposed to the full fury of the fire, the result is catastrophic beyond imagination. The ancient oak beams, seasoned to the hardness of iron, but dried to the consistency of tinder, simply explode into flame. The interior of St. Paul's becomes a furnace, a vast stone chamber filled with fire that reaches temperatures unknown in any normal conflagration. The heat becomes so intense that books, priceless manuscripts stored in the cathedral's library, don't just burn, they vaporize, lifting off their shelves as sheets of paper that spiral upward through the superheated air like strange snow made of knowledge and memory. Witnesses standing outside the cathedral describe a scene that defies belief, pages from ancient texts flying through the air above London, carried by updrafts so powerful that they lift entire volumes and scatter them across the burning city like messages from a dying civilization. Books that contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries, manuscripts that preserve knowledge from the classical world, religious texts that represented the spiritual heritage of medieval England, all of it dissolving into ash and ember and fragments of paper that dance through the smoky air like butterflies made of flame. But the destruction goes even deeper than books and timbers, even beyond the loss of the roof and its contents. The stones themselves, those massive blocks of limestone that form the cathedral's walls and pillars, begin to crack and split under the impossible heat. Stone that has stood for centuries, that seemed as permanent as the earth itself, starts to fracture with sounds like cannon fire. The science behind this destruction is both simple and terrible. When limestone is heated beyond a certain point, around 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, it begins to decompose, breaking down into lime and carbon dioxide. The process, called calcination, transforms solid rock into crumbling powder that can no longer support the enormous weight of a cathedral's walls and vaults. As Tuesday progresses, as the fire maintains its grip on St. Paul's throughout the day, more and more of the cathedral's stonework begins to fail. Pillars that have supported the roof for 6 centuries start to lean and buckle. Walls that seemed eternal begin to crack and crumble, and the entire structure starts its slow, inevitable collapse. The bells, those bronze giants that have called Londoners to prayer for generations, melt in their towers like ice in summer sunshine. The bronze flows in molten streams down the cathedral's interior walls, pooling in twisted shapes that will cool into abstract sculptures of destruction, permanent monuments to heat beyond human comprehension. By evening on Tuesday, St. Paul's Cathedral is a hollow shell, its roof gone, its interior gutted, its stones cracked and crumbling, its bells transformed into puddles of cooling metal. The building that was meant to last until the end of time, that was built as an offering to eternity itself, has been reduced to a smoking ruin in less than a day. The loss of St. Paul's strikes London with an impact that goes far beyond the mere destruction of another building, even a building as magnificent as the cathedral. For 6 centuries, St. Paul's has been more than a church. It's been the spiritual and symbolic heart of London, the fixed point around which the entire city organized itself. Its spire has been the landmark that guided travellers from miles away. Its bells have marked the rhythm of London's days. Its very existence has been proof that some things, some achievements, could transcend the normal limits of time and mortality. Now all of that is gone, reduced to ash and memory in a single day. And if St. Paul's can burn, if even the greatest achievement of medieval London can disappear so quickly and completely, then nothing, absolutely nothing, can be considered safe. The news of St. Paul's destruction spreads through the refugee camps and temporary shelters where displaced Londoners wait for the fire to end. Many refuse to believe it at first. The loss seems too great, too impossible to accept. But as the reports multiply, as witness after witness confirms the incredible news, a kind of despair settles over the evacuees that goes beyond mere fear for their personal property. They are witnessing the end of their world. Not just the physical world of houses and shops and familiar streets, but the mental world of shared landmarks and common assumptions about permanence and security. The London they knew, the medieval city that had grown organically over centuries, is disappearing so completely that future generations will struggle to even imagine what it looked like. But even the loss of St. Paul's, devastating as it is, cannot slow the fire's advance. If anything, the cathedral's destruction seems to energize the flames, providing fuel for an even more intense conflagration that reaches outward from the cathedral's ruins like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Tuesday evening brings word that the fire has reached the Guildhall, that ancient seat of London's government, where the city's mayors and aldermen have governed for more than 5 centuries. The Guildhall, built of stone like St. Paul's, but on a smaller scale, suffers the same fate as the cathedral. Its roof timbers explode into flame, its lead covering melts and runs down the walls in silver streams, its stones crack and crumble under heat that exceeds anything its builders could have imagined. But perhaps most poignant of all, the Guildhall's famous library burns with particular intensity. This collection, one of the finest in medieval England, contains manuscripts and books that represent centuries of accumulated learning, legal documents that record London's ancient rights and privileges, chronicles that preserve the city's history, scientific and philosophical works that connect London to the broader world of European scholarship. All of it feeds the flames until the Guildhall's interior becomes another furnace, consuming the accumulated wisdom of generations. The destruction of the Guildhall's library represents more than the loss of books. It's the destruction of London's institutional memory. The documents that burned in the Guildhall contained the legal and historical foundation of the city's identity, the accumulated precedents and traditions that defined what it meant to be a Londoner. When those documents burned, when centuries of careful record-keeping disappeared in a single afternoon, London lost not just buildings but the very documentation of its own past. As Tuesday night falls, as September 4th gives way to what everyone hopes will be the fire's final day, London lies prostrate under a pall of smoke so thick that the moon and stars disappear entirely. The fire has consumed roughly 3/4 of the old city, transformed neighbourhoods that existed when William the Conqueror arrived into landscapes that look like the surface of an alien planet. But more than buildings, more than neighbourhoods, more than individual landmarks, the fire has consumed London's sense of itself. The medieval city that slept peacefully on Saturday night, secure in the permanence of its ancient walls and time-tested traditions, has awakened to find that permanence itself is an illusion, that centuries of patient accumulation can disappear faster than anyone believed possible. The refugees huddled in Moorfields and the royal parks, the evacuees camping along the Thames and in the fields north of the city, they are not just displaced persons waiting to return home. They are the survivors of a civilization, witnesses to the end of medieval London, and the violent birth of something entirely new. Yet even in this darkest hour, even as London burns more completely than any city in European memory, there are signs that the fire's appetite may finally be reaching its limits. The wind that has fed the flames for 3 days, that steady easterly blast that carried sparks across the rooftops and fanned every ember to roaring life, begins to shift and weaken as Tuesday night progresses. More importantly, the fire has consumed so much of the old city that it's beginning to reach areas where buildings are more scattered, where gardens and open spaces create natural fire breaks that even this extraordinary conflagration cannot easily cross. The dense medieval heart of London, that perfect fuel for urban fire, has been largely consumed, leaving the flames with less concentrated nourishment for their continued advance. And at long last, there are signs of organised resistance. The Duke of York, the future King James II, finally arrives in London with real authority and the will to use it. He brings Royal Navy sailors into the burning city, men trained in the kind of disciplined teamwork necessary to handle emergencies at sea. These sailors know how to work together under extreme pressure, how to follow orders when panic threatens to overwhelm rational thought, how to handle the heavy ropes and pulleys needed to demolish buildings quickly and systematically. Throughout Tuesday night, working by the light of the burning city itself, these naval crews begin the systematic destruction of entire rows of houses ahead of the fire's advance. It's heartbreaking work, pulling down perfectly sound buildings to save the neighbourhoods beyond. But it's the first truly effective action taken since the fire began. The fire breaks work, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. House by house, street by street, the naval crews create gaps that even this extraordinary fire cannot cross. For the first time in 4 days, the flames begin to encounter obstacles they cannot overcome, barriers they cannot simply consume and move beyond. Wednesday morning, September 5th, dawns grey and smoky over a London that has been transformed beyond recognition. The Great Wall of Flame that has dominated the city's skyline for 4 days, that has created its own weather and generated its own winds, begins to break apart into smaller, more manageable fires. The fire continues to burn in scattered locations and will continue smouldering for days to come. But the great advance has been stopped. The systematic destruction of buildings ahead of the flames, combined with the changing wind patterns and the fire's own exhaustion of fuel, has finally broken the back of the conflagration that consumed medieval London. If you're still with us on this journey through London's darkest hours, still following the flames that consumed a medieval city and cleared the ground for a modern one, please consider subscribing to Simply About Earth. Your support allows us to continue telling these important stories, these forgotten chapters of human resilience and renewal that remind us how much we can endure and how much we can rebuild. The London that emerges from the smoke on Wednesday morning, the city that becomes visible as the great fire finally begins to lose its grip, is not the London that went to sleep on Saturday night. In 4 days, just 4 days, the fire has consumed roughly 80% of the old city within the ancient Roman walls, 13,000 houses, 87 churches, countless shops and markets and guild halls, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, St. Paul's Cathedral, all gone, reduced to ash and blackened stone, and memories that will ache for generations. The statistics, when they are finally compiled, tell a story of destruction that exceeds anything in English history. An area stretching from the Tower of London in the east to the Temple in the west, from the Thames in the south to the old city walls in the north, has been almost completely devastated. 436 acres, an area larger than the modern City of London financial district, lies in ruins. But statistics cannot capture the human dimension of what has happened, the transformation of hundreds of thousands of lives in the space of a few days. Families that were comfortable, even prosperous, on Saturday night find themselves destitute refugees on Wednesday morning. Merchants who own shops and warehouses full of goods discover that their entire stock, their entire livelihood, has literally gone up in smoke. The immediate humanitarian crisis is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Londoners made homeless in a matter of days, camping in fields and parks, living in makeshift shelters constructed from whatever materials they could salvage from their burning homes. King Charles II, to his credit, opens the royal parks to the refugees, but even this gesture barely scratches the surface of the need. Moorfields, that great open space north of the city walls, becomes a canvas city where the displaced attempt to rebuild some semblance of normal life. Families construct crude shelters from salvaged timbers and torn canvas. Merchants try to restart their trades from handcarts and temporary stalls. Children who lost their homes play games among the ash-covered refugees, while their parents stare toward the smoking ruins and try to comprehend the magnitude of their loss. But perhaps the most profound damage is psychological, spiritual. Even Londoners have lost more than houses and churches and familiar landmarks. They've lost their entire mental map of their city. Streets they walked every day have simply vanished. Neighborhoods where families lived for generations have been erased so completely that it becomes difficult to even remember where they once stood. Samuel Pepys, walking through the ruins on Thursday morning, captures this sense of complete disorientation in words that still echo across the centuries. "I walked into the town," he writes, "and find Fenchurch Street, Gracechurch Street, and Lombard Street all in dust. The Exchange a sad sight, nothing standing there, of all the statues or pillars but Sir Thomas Gresham's picture in the corner. All in dust, as if centuries of human endeavour had simply dissolved, returned to the elements from which they came. The great commercial streets where London's wealth was created and displayed, the Exchange where merchants from across Europe gathered to trade, the familiar landmarks that gave the city its identity, all reduced to ash and rubble in 4 days of unprecedented destruction. The immediate aftermath becomes a test of London's, of England's, fundamental character. Will the city rebuild? And if so, how? Will it attempt to recreate what was lost? Or will it use this catastrophe as an opportunity to create something entirely new? Food becomes scarce, not because there isn't enough in the kingdom, but because the markets and distribution networks that fed London have been destroyed along with everything else. The bakers who provided daily bread, the fishmongers who sold fresh catch from the Thames, the tavern keepers who fed travellers and workers, all of them have lost not just their shops but their entire means of making a living. Water becomes contaminated with ash and debris from the fire, making it dangerous to drink from wells and pumps that once provided safe water for hundreds of thousands of people. Sanitation becomes a nightmare when 250,000 people are suddenly living in temporary camps without proper facilities, crowded together in conditions that breed disease and desperation. The threat of epidemic looms over the refugee camps, always the fear when large populations are displaced. When normal hygiene becomes impossible, when stress and malnutrition weaken immune systems that are already strained by trauma and uncertainty. For weeks after the fire, months, even, London teeters on the edge of catastrophes that might dwarf even the fire itself. But perhaps most challenging of all is the simple question of identity, of what it means to be a Londoner, when London itself has largely ceased to exist. The physical landmarks that anchored the city's sense of itself, the parish churches where families worshipped for generations, the guild halls where craftsmen organized their trades, the markets where housewives bought their daily necessities, all of these are gone, leaving survivors to navigate not just physical devastation, but a complete disruption of their mental map of home. Yet even in the depths of this catastrophe, even as London lies in ruins and its people struggle to survive in refugee camps, there are signs of something remarkable stirring in the ashes. Within days of the fire's end, even while smoke still rises from the ruins, the planning begins, not just for rebuilding what was lost, but for creating something entirely new, something better, something worthy of London's growing ambitions as a centre of trade and empire. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect and scientist whose name will become synonymous with London's rebirth, begins sketching plans for a new cathedral even before the stones of the old St. Paul's have cooled. But his vision extends far beyond a single building. He imagines a complete transformation of London's medieval layout, wide boulevards replacing narrow alleys, grand squares providing space and light, a city designed according to the principles of reason and geometry, rather than the organic chaos of centuries. John Evelyn, the diarist and scientist whose careful observations rival those of Pepys, proposes an even more radical transformation. His plans call for the complete abandonment of London's medieval street pattern, a clean slate approach that would create an entirely new city on the bones of the old, with broad avenues radiating from central points like the spokes of a wheel. But even more ambitious are the plans put forward by Robert Hooke, the experimental philosopher and architect, whose scientific mind sees the fire as an opportunity to apply rational principles to urban design. Hooke's vision encompasses not just new streets and buildings, but new systems for fire prevention, new approaches to sanitation and public health, new ways of organizing commercial and residential districts for maximum efficiency and safety. These grand plans, beautiful in their ambition, rational in their approach, ultimately prove too radical for a city eager to rebuild and resume its commercial life. Property owners want to rebuild on their old plots. Merchants need to reopen their shops as quickly as possible. The everyday needs of commerce and survival don't allow for the patient implementation of grand urban planning schemes. But even the partial implementation of these plans, even the compromises forced by practical necessity, transform London in ways that echo down to the present day. The Rebuilding Act of 1667, passed by Parliament to regulate the reconstruction, establishes building codes that prioritize fire safety over immediate convenience. New buildings must be constructed of brick or stone rather than timber. Streets must be wider than the medieval alleys they replace, and specific provisions are made for the systematic creation of fire breaks and emergency access routes. More importantly, the very idea that a city can be consciously designed rather than simply allowed to grow organically, this concept, forced upon London by catastrophe, influences urban planning across Europe and eventually around the world. The fire that destroyed medieval London also cleared the intellectual ground for thinking about cities as systems that can be analysed, improved, and consciously shaped according to rational principles. Christopher Wren's genius finds its fullest expression not in the grand street plans that prove impossible to implement, but in the churches. 51 new parish churches will rise in the burned area of London, each one a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, each one uniquely suited to its site and congregation, each one a small miracle of stone and light rising from the ashes of medieval predecessors. These churches, designed by Wren and his assistants over the course of decades, represent more than architectural achievement. They become laboratories for new approaches to sacred space, experiments in how classical proportions and Baroque decoration can create environments that serve both spiritual and practical needs. Each church solves unique problems of site and function, creating a body of architectural innovation that influences church design across the English-speaking world. But it's St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece, that becomes the most powerful symbol of London's rebirth. Rising from the ruins of the medieval cathedral, the new St. Paul's represents a complete break with the past, a Baroque vision of domes and classical proportions that would have been unthinkable before the fire cleared the ground. The new cathedral takes 35 years to complete. An entire generation of Londoners lives and dies during its construction. Workers who lay the foundation stones as young men see their sons and grandsons carving the final decorations in the dome. But when it's finally finished, when its great dome dominates the London skyline like a man-made mountain, it represents more than architectural achievement. It becomes proof that from the greatest disasters can come the greatest triumphs. The human stories of rebuilding prove as remarkable as the architectural ones. Families who lost everything in the fire slowly, patiently reconstructing their lives from ash and memory. Merchants who saw their stock and shops consumed by flames somehow find the resources, through borrowing, through partnerships, through sheer determination, to restart their trades in new locations with new methods. The Fariners, that family whose bakery started the entire catastrophe, eventually rebuild on the same spot where their first shop burned. Their new bakery, constructed according to the latest building codes, becomes a symbol of London's refusal to be defeated by disaster. Where once stood timber and thatch, now rises brick and tile, designed with conscious attention to fire safety, but continuing the same trade that has fed London for generations. The insurance industry, born directly from the practical needs of merchants who had suffered total loss in the fire, begins to develop the principles and practices that will eventually spread across the world. The idea that risk can be shared, that individual catastrophe can be cushioned by collective preparation, emerges directly from the ashes of 1666. Fire insurance companies, some of which still exist today, trace their origins to the weeks and months immediately following the Great Fire. New building techniques develop, not just the obvious shift from timber to brick and stone, but subtler innovations in foundation design, in chimney construction, in the spacing of buildings to prevent the rapid spread of fire. The London that rises from the ashes is not just more beautiful than its predecessor, it's more resilient, more thoughtfully designed, more prepared for the disasters that time will inevitably bring. The fire also transforms London's relationship with the rest of England and with the wider world. The massive reconstruction effort draws workers, materials, and investment from across the kingdom, creating economic ripple effects that extend far beyond the burned areas. The demand for brick and stone, for timber and iron, for skilled craftsmen and common labourers stimulates economic activity throughout England and beyond. But perhaps more importantly, the fire establishes London's reputation as a city that cannot be defeated by disaster. The speed and thoroughness of the reconstruction, the way London emerges from catastrophe, not just rebuilt but improved, sends a message to the world that this is a city with confidence in its own future. International merchants who might have been tempted to shift their business to other ports, foreign investors who might have questioned London's stability, see instead a city that responds to disaster with innovation and determination. The London that emerges from the ashes of 1666 is more attractive to international commerce than the medieval city that burned, more connected to European networks of trade and ideas, more confident in its ability to adapt and grow. The intellectual impact may be even more significant. The fire occurs during what historians call the scientific revolution, when new ways of thinking about the natural world are transforming European culture. The systematic study of the fire, the careful documentation of how it spread, what fed it, what finally stopped it, contributes to emerging understanding of combustion, of building design, of urban planning as a science rather than an art. Samuel Pepys's diary, those careful daily observations that capture both the human drama and the practical details of the fire, becomes one of the foundational documents of empirical observation. The idea that careful documentation of events can lead to better understanding and better preparation for future challenges, this methodical approach to knowledge reinforced by the fire experience, helps establish the observational methods that characterize modern science. John Evelyn's writings about the fire and its aftermath, his proposals for rational urban planning, and his observations about the relationship between urban design and public health influence thinking about cities across Europe. The fire becomes a case study in how disasters can be prevented, or at least mitigated, through conscious planning and rational design. Even the Royal Society, that pioneering institution of experimental science, takes a keen interest in the fire and its lessons. Members conduct systematic studies of combustion, investigate new building materials and techniques, and apply scientific methods to questions of urban planning and disaster preparedness. The fire, in other words, becomes not just a tragedy to be overcome, but a natural experiment to be studied and learned from. The fire influences literature and art as well, becoming a touchstone for discussions of divine judgment, human resilience, and the relationship between destruction and renewal. John Dryden's poem Annus Mirabilis, written in the immediate aftermath of the fire, captures both the terror of the disaster and the hope of reconstruction, using the fire as a metaphor for London's and England's capacity for renewal and growth. Painters and engravers find in the burning city a subject that combines terrible beauty with profound symbolic meaning, images of flames consuming ancient buildings, while new structures rise in the background become popular across Europe. The fire enters the visual imagination of the age as a symbol of transformation, of the way destruction can clear the ground for creation. Theologians debate whether the fire represents divine punishment for sin or simply the natural consequence of human choices, but even those who see God's hand in the disaster tend to interpret the successful reconstruction as evidence of divine favor. The fire becomes a test that London and Protestant England has passed, emerging stronger and more virtuous than before. As we approach the end of our journey through those 4 days that changed London forever, it's worth reflecting on what the Great Fire teaches us about the nature of catastrophe and renewal. The fire was undoubtedly a tragedy, a disaster that caused immense suffering and loss, but it was also, paradoxically, one of the most important events in London's development into a modern city. This paradox, the way destruction can clear the ground for creation, the way loss can lead to renewal, is one of the great themes of human history. Civilizations rise and fall, cities burn and are rebuilt. Individuals lose everything and find ways to begin again. The Great Fire of London is just one example of this eternal cycle, but it's a particularly vivid one, a case study in how humans respond when everything familiar suddenly disappears. The speed of the fire, the way it consumed centuries of accumulated culture in just 4 days, reminds us how fragile our material achievements really are. The buildings we think of as permanent, the institutions we assume will last forever, the very layout of our cities, all of it can disappear far more quickly than it was created. But the response to the fire, the immediate mobilization of resources to help the displaced, the rapid development of new building techniques, the patient work of reconstruction that continued for decades, this response reminds us of something else about human nature. Our capacity to adapt, to learn, to build something better from the ruins of what came before. The London that emerged from the ashes of 1666 was not the same city that burned. It was something new, something that incorporated the lessons learned through catastrophe. The wider streets, the brick buildings, the improved firefighting capabilities, the insurance systems, the building codes, all of these innovations emerged directly from the experience of loss. And perhaps that's the most important lesson the Great Fire teaches us, that catastrophe, terrible as it is, can also be a teacher. The fire showed Londoners the vulnerabilities in their medieval city, the dangers of building entirely in timber, of creating streets too narrow for effective emergency response, of lacking organized systems for dealing with large-scale disasters. Once these vulnerabilities were revealed, once the cost of ignoring them became clear, it became possible to address them. The London that rose from the ashes was more resilient, not because its builders were more clever than their predecessors, but because they had learned from disaster what their predecessors could only learn through disaster. This is the eternal human story, the way we progress through failure as much as through success, the way catastrophe becomes the teacher that prosperity could never be. The Great Fire of London is exceptional only in its scale and in the quality of its documentation. The underlying pattern it represents, destruction leading to renewal, loss leading to learning, is as old as human civilization itself. the confidence that London gained through successfully meeting the challenge of reconstruction, the proof that even the most devastating disaster could be overcome, served the city well in the centuries that followed. When London faced the challenges of rapid industrialization, when it struggled to accommodate the millions who flocked to it during the Victorian era, when it endured the bombing campaigns of 2 world wars, the example of 1666 was always there, the proof that even the most complete destruction could become the foundation for something better. Today, more than 350 years after Thomas Farriner's bakery caught fire on Pudding Lane, London still bears the marks of those 4 September days in 1666. The street pattern that emerged from the reconstruction, the building techniques that developed in response to the fire, the insurance industry that grew from the ashes, all of these innovations continue to influence how we build and protect our cities. St. Paul's Cathedral still dominates the London skyline, Wren's masterpiece, a permanent reminder of human resilience and creativity. The church stands not as a symbol of what was lost in the fire, but of what became possible because of it. Every time Londoners look up at that great dome, they see proof that from the greatest disasters can come the greatest achievements. The narrow medieval alleys that fed the fire so hungrily are mostly gone, replaced by the broader streets and more rational layout that emerged from the reconstruction, but here and there, in Pudding Lane where it all began, in small corners that escaped both the flames and the later improvements, traces of medieval London survive. These fragments serve as reminders not just of what was lost, but of how far the city has travelled since that September morning when one baker's banked ovens refused to sleep. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, from the first spark in Thomas Farriner's bakery to the great reconstruction that followed, thank you for being part of the Simply About Earth community. Your engagement, your willingness to explore these deep currents of human history with us, that's what makes this work possible and meaningful. The fire changed more than London's physical appearance. It changed how the city thought about itself. Before 1666, London was a medieval city with medieval ideas about permanence and change. After the fire, after witnessing how quickly the work of centuries could disappear, London became something different. A modern city with a modern understanding of the need to adapt, to improve, to prepare for the challenges that time would bring. This transformation of mindset may be the fire's most lasting legacy, the way it taught an entire city that catastrophe could be a teacher rather than simply an enemy. The London that emerged from the ashes was more than rebuilt. It was reimagined, using the hard-won lessons of disaster to create something more resilient than what came before. And so we come to the end of our journey through those 4 September days that changed London forever. From the first spark in a Pudding Lane bakery to the great Baroque cathedral that rose from medieval ashes, it's been a story of loss and renewal, of how quickly human achievements can disappear and how patiently they can be rebuilt, of the way catastrophe can clear the ground for innovations that prosperity alone could never inspire. The Great Fire of London reminds us that history is not just a chronicle of steady progress. It's also a story of disruption and adaptation, of the way societies learn to build better by first learning what burns. The flames that consumed medieval London in September 1666 also illuminated possibilities that its residents had never imagined, clearing the ground not just for new buildings but for new ways of thinking about what a city could be. In that sense, the fire that began as London's greatest disaster became one of its greatest opportunities. The city that rose from the ashes was more than a replacement for what was lost. It was a statement of faith in human ingenuity and resilience, a demonstration that even the most complete destruction could become the foundation for something better. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are part of that same human story of resilience and renewal. The challenges you face, the losses you endure, the disasters both personal and collective that life will inevitably bring, all of these are part of the same eternal cycle that played out in London in 1666, the cycle of destruction and creation, of learning through loss, of building something better from the ruins of what came before. Sweet dreams of cities rising from ashes, of human creativity, transforming disaster into opportunity, of the patient work of reconstruction that follows every catastrophe. Dream of Christopher Wren's churches reaching toward the sky, of new streets replacing old alleys, of the great dome of St. Paul's Cathedral standing as eternal proof that from the greatest fires can come the greatest light. The story continues, and you are part of it. Rest well, and thank you for joining us at Simply About Earth, where we remember that every ending is also a beginning, every disaster also an opportunity, every loss also a chance to build something better than what came before. Good night.